Everyone. It's so nice to see everybody here. I'm just going to give it another quick minute. I think folks are filtering in. We have a fair number of people registered, but we want to make sure people have time to actually get into the room. And as you do that, notice that there is a chat at the bottom of your screen. So as you join us, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, give us your name and where you're from. And if you're a teacher, tell us that. So we know who our heroes from the classroom are today, who are joining us. I want to just say how happy I am to have you all here with us today. This is the third installment of the ABE Teacher Roundtable series, which is a brand new feature from the ABE Program Office this year. And for those of you who don't know, ABE stands for the Amgen Biotech Experience, which you can see right behind me, which of course brings authentic biotech labs to life for high school students and gives them that hands-on bench experience. We just want to preface today by saying we know this has been a really tough time in education, and so some of you are joining us in real time, and we know many of you will be joining us later when you're able to make the time after class. It's been a lot of change and churn for classroom teachers, so we hope you join us when you can, and we hope that you find this roundtable both practical and inspiring, and that it becomes something you can really bring to life in your own classroom. And so our goals for this roundtable today are for you as teachers to become familiar with some of the current trends and workplace applications in data literacy, to be able to identify some specific data literacy skills that can be developed in science classrooms, and last but certainly not least, to be able to access some data literacy resources on LabXchange to support instruction in your own classroom. And you'll learn a little bit more about that later in the roundtable. And so I'm going to try to be short and sweet with my introductions and give our panelists some time to talk a little more about themselves. But first, I want to introduce 4 wonderful volunteers we have from Amgen who have joined us to talk about their work. Dan Geschvend is the Director of Data Science, and he is a knowledge scientist and data strategist at Amgen who has over 20 years of experience transforming the leveraging of data for decision-making within pharmaceutical R&D and operations. And Dan leads the vision for Amgen's Enterprise Data Fabric, which is a corporate scale knowledge network that reimagines how staff think about, interact with, and get insight from data connected together. And so Dan will tell you a little more in just a minute about his work. We'd like to welcome Brian Yee, who is the Director of Knowledge Management in R&D at Amgen. And Brian is responsible for driving the creation and continuous improvement of a modern and sustainable knowledge management practice, with an emphasis on facilitating the increased adoption of innovative approaches to drug development. And so over the last 15 years, Brian has held various roles across Amgen, spanning information technology, process improvement, corporate transformation, and chief of staff and strategic planning. So we're really happy to have you with us, Brian. Next, I'd like to introduce Stacy Bransma, who is data scientist on the digital health and innovation team at Amgen. Stacy has worked as a data scientist across many areas of the healthcare space, including biotech, pharma, hospitals, and public health, with projects ranging from clinical trial analysis, controlled substance monitoring, and COVID-19 modeling, most timely this month and today. Prior to transitioning into data science, she worked in Zambia, managing and monitoring various development projects. So thank you for being with us today, Stacy. Next, we'd like to introduce Wes Field, who is a principal machine learning engineer within Amgen's digital health and innovation, where he works to deploy data science and machine learning to every edge of the business. And I just love this. And he works to give data scientists a tight, warm hug of technology, which we all need, whether or not we're in data science. During his tenure at Amgen, Wes has worked on a diverse array of projects, including COVID wave modeling, identification of synthetic lethal gene pairs, and clinical trial optimization. He's spent most of his professional career as a software engineer in the life science and biotech space. So thanks for being with us, Wes. And last, but most definitely not least, we have Marty Samuel, who's joining us as the head of content at LabXchange. And many ABE teachers are already familiar with the great stuff on LabXchange. which is a free online platform that curates and develops interactive content to inspire users to think of themselves as scientists and to approach questions scientifically. As a former associate director for science at Harvard's Derek Bach Center for Teaching and Learning, Marty has worked with faculty across the Division of Science to incorporate authentic and motivating data analysis into their courses. And we know from working with Marty, he's an incredibly energetic and enthusiastic thought partner, and also works with our ABE Master Teacher Fellows. So very happy to have you with us as well, Marty. So thank you all for joining us today. And I've just scratched the surface of what you do, and I know you can bring it to life a lot better. So really the first question I have for each of you is, what is your current role and how is that connected to data literacy? How do you use data literacy in the work that you do every day? I'll just open it up. Maybe we can start with you, Dan.
Sure. So thank you everyone for joining. I know schedules and conflicts don't allow for everyone to get to it. So appreciate you making the time. Looking forward to a fun session. I guess I'll start by saying that I think most of us are focused on the science side of things, and it's important, I think, as we go through today to think about biotech is actually a much broader business of bringing medicines to market, which much broader than just scientific research in a sense, which also includes clinical trials, manufacturing, supply chain, marketing, healthcare providers, insurance, and patients, right? So it's a whole gamut that bringing a medicine to market requires. And we have to be able to pull data together from that entire spectrum in order to be able to answer our most pressing challenges. My background is in the research end, so I love the science, but obviously bringing a medicine to market requires a whole lot more than that. And so in today's day and age, products of companies today are as much the data that they create as the physical goods that they produce. So beyond just medicines, Amgen is a data company as well. And so for us to be able to harness the totality of all of the data that we have access to is really important for us to be able to deliver better medicines in the future. And so my background in particular is on the research side. I currently work in the manufacturing and supply chain side of the business. Been at Amgen about 15 years, and I've been fortunate to see a broad swath of that life cycle of data and process across Amgen. And a recurring theme that I see is that data is typically collected and managed in these local silos, and it really needs to be unlocked and democratized in a sense. We need to do a better job of taking the data out of all these farms of data across the company, organizing it and making it more broadly available to the people that need to make decisions. So my team builds what we call an enterprise knowledge graph. And by graph, I mean a network, not a chart. And it's also called a data fabric, interwoven network of data, like a map. And it allows you to query and traverse across the company's data very easily. And we keep adding to it like hyperlink pages on the internet, but just for data. And whether it's proteins or cells or experiments or people or materials or products or cities, they're all in this network. And they all get connected together in this linked data fashion. We'll talk about that more. And we build this network for two reasons. One, so that teams that create the data can have their data more broadly used by others. And two, so the real data scientists like Wes and Stacy are actually going to be able to bring that data to bear on the insights. So from a literacy perspective, we kind of sit as brokers between the people that create the data and the people that need the data. And we have to sort of understand the data from both sides. So literacy is front and center in everything we do in terms of bringing data to the broader community at Amgen.
I love what you're saying, Dan, about that kind of democratization of data. And before all of our participants joined us, we were talking a little bit about data literacy as a civic skill, something that all citizens need to be able to participate in daily life. Thank you so much for that. And I wonder, Brian, if I could ask you to talk a little about what you do in the connections to data literacy.
Yeah, so my team works in a similar space as Dan does. We are in a knowledge management team, and that's very corporate speak for what do we know about stuff that is important to our business. And so the specific area that I work in is related to clinical trials. This is a very expensive, time-consuming part of the R&D process that is the crucial step from saying we've got something that might help patients to we've generated the data and the evidence and it's crossed the threshold of regulatory approval. So now that this experimental drug has been proven to do what it said it would do, it's now medicine for patients who need it. And one of the things we ask ourselves is, well, how do we help those scientists, those drug developers, those researchers have knowledge at their fingertips, if you will, to be able to make the decisions, make the connections, and so forth. And so as Dan said, I think one of the key things for us from a data literacy perspective is that it's not about how much you can write down on a piece of paper, but what already has been written digitally that we can harness, bring to bear, and put in front of people in thoughtful ways to inform those decisions. Is so much about the work that we do. We are a science-based company, but that science goes down to how we use data to inform decision-making, and having an understanding of that network, if you will, of decisions, data, how to make use of it, interrogate it, is a critical part about bringing our best to the table.
I love that, Brian, and the sort of creation of stories and what does the data tell you? How does it speak to you, rather than trying to reinvent that and tell it in some other way? Thank you so much, Brian. Wes, how about for you?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about what I do. So I'm a principal machine learning engineer. I guess I usually work with a team of data scientists. The kind of delineation between myself and a data scientist is I am much more focused on that hug of technology. And that hug of technology usually needs to occur when we have a really great insight from our data science that we want to actually deploy. And deployment can mean a lot of things, but really what deployment means is we want to put that insight to, in the hands of our, our business users, or, different edges of Amgen. So I've worked on a number of projects where data literacy is extremely important, right? Because I have to kind of take a proof of concept or something that is kind of working and build it out. Make it more robust and put it in the hands of sort of the operational folks at Amgen. So, like Brian said, I also worked on the clinical trials project, but to really make sure that we could capitulate a machine learning result for multiple clinical trials over years, not just kind of once, but reproducibly over and over and over again. And so, as an engineer, that I kind of take a different, I maybe have a slightly different approach than a data scientist would be, because I'm interested in things like deployment, scalability, reproducibility, and kind of good engineering practices. And that's kind of what I've been focused on at Amgen as a machine learning engineer. So kind of looking into the future of Amgen, those are the things that I really want to improve, are that those kind of continuous delivery of results to different edges, and really using data to make decisions and make better decisions continuously every day. And I think that's what I'm super passionate about in kind of the realm of data literacy.
And what you're saying is so interesting, because what it's raising for me as sort of a classroom educator is the range of skills that you might be thinking about as you approach data literacy, and the kinds of different questions you might ask depending on what lens you have on the data. So I really appreciate your saying how your realm might be different from some data scientists that we might hear from with the same question.
Yeah, I think, I'm very much a builder, and there's kind of roles for all different sort of personas within data, not just the statistics driven analytical people. I would say that isn't really actually my strong suit, but definitely engineering and building things and architecture is, but I've found a really nice home in data science at Amgen, kind of supporting those different use cases.
I love that. And I think that will speak to many of our teachers and students who may feel that it's a field that is not open to them, or that they're intimidated by. So hearing that there can be a home and a way for them to engage with data literacy is so great. Stacy, I don't know if any of that resonates with you, or you can talk a little about your lens on the work.
Absolutely. So I'm a data scientist. I work with Wes on the digital health and innovation team. And, data literacy is basically my entire job. If I didn't have it, I couldn't do what I do. A data scientist essentially tries to identify patterns in historical relationships and sees, did something happen before? Are we going to say it's going to happen again in a similar circumstance? So one of the projects that I'm working on is this clinical trial analysis project, where we're trying to identify trial sites or clinics that could recruit patients faster. So what characteristics of a clinic are we identifying that are important in determining the rate at which we can recruit patients? So, in order to really predict that, you need to understand all of the factors that go into making a clinical trial effective. So we look at things like patient population characteristics, the location of the clinic, how past trials have been completed or not, and all of those things. You have to really understand the data, be able to poke and prod it, and understand what it's telling you in order to make effective predictions.
It's so interesting because I hear as you talk about predictions, it strikes me that that's so different from just kind of being given a closed-ended problem to solve, but instead there's this element of curiosity and questioning that you have to bring. Absolutely. Is that something you had, do you think, to start with, or how was that cultivated for you when you were a student?
That's a really good question. I think it's a little bit of both. I think you have to be open-minded and able to say, I don't know what's happening, but I want to try and figure out what's going on. So being willing to kind of not know something, but wanting to figure it out is a fun and useful skill for sure.
And I'm laughing because I see we have one of our site directors from Massachusetts, Alia Katarna, who has talked a lot about sort of how do we instill in our students the ability to fail and to see failure as a part of the process. And so welcome, Alia. Glad you could join us today. And that certainly resonated with me, given what I've heard from you over the years. So this kind of brings me to the next question, which is we have this unique opportunity to have all of you here. Marty, I want you to share a little about what you're doing that kind of builds a bridge between this professional setting and students. What's your role and how is data literacy connected?
Thanks, Jessica. So, we are similarly a company that's, at LabXchange, we are a free online science education company that's dedicated towards making science accessible, meaningful, motivated for teachers and students around the world. So one thing that we're always desperate to know about is what's working. A major thing that data is important for us is to identify what lessons or activities that we are designing do people like to use, which ones do they share with their friends, with their colleagues, and also what are the aspects of people's most favorite activities, most favorite lessons? Do they like short videos? Do they like interactive things? Do they like something that's more rigorous and kind of gives them a deeper dive into kind of a more authentic, engaged experience? So there's a lot of user experience that we're always using to always improve ourselves, kind of understand what is it that we can do best, that people most respond to, and how do we do the best job of that. We also use a ton of data internally to figure out how to make those products. How do we make those lessons the best? Everything that we do is a beautiful collaboration between these really dynamic teams. We have scientists on our staff. We have creative teams of graphic designers and animators and computer scientists who create interactivity for various of our lessons. And so how do we coordinate everyone's energy and best efforts so that we can all kind of synergize and work together most productively? So a lot of data internally that we use is for planning, strategizing, being able to reach the users in the way that we best want to be able to reach our users. And also we are an education company. So we also care a lot about teaching people how to interpret data, how to develop those skills of data literacy. And I think one thing that we are very thoughtful about is that, historically education has had this role of disseminating information, that our job was to make people learn information. I'm by training a structural biologist. I had to memorize what the amino acids looked like when I was a kid. But in the classes I've taught, I've never asked anyone to memorize what the amino acids look like, because now we're in the information age. Everyone in their phone they can look up any amino acid they'll ever want. So the question now that we think about in terms of data literacy is, how do we teach people to take the information that they have access to and to make use of it? How do they evaluate that information? If you Google something and you get 100 results back on your Google search, how do you pick the best one that you as an expert know is a trustworthy source? If you look up a paper on PubMed, how do you know that it is the right paper for you? So learning how to evaluate and vet and make use of information, or critique information if you think it's being used inaccurately, are major components of data literacy that we're always trying to think about. And particularly, I'll just mention one project we're very excited about in the near future is teaching people how to make predictions and how to understand predictions as they relate to things like understanding our climate and how our climate might be changing, and like what are the underlying science behind that. So both kind of internally and also from like a meta level, we're always thinking about like data literacy from those two perspectives.
It really strikes me as you were speaking that you raised a couple of things that I think may resonate with some of our teachers, which is this idea of we're all using data in some way or another, whether it's formally or informally. So this kind of idea that we are all data practitioners to some degree. And then the second piece that you raised is, so what are the critical thinking skills that we're bringing? And there are very specific critical thinking skills that teachers already know about and maybe have already been using, but perhaps not in this space. And so it's just really interesting to hear how you're thinking about that at LabXchange and bringing that to life for educators. And for those of you who are joining us, I know we've had people kind of rolling in today. We definitely understand. And so we're really happy to have you here. And we want to encourage all of you, particularly our teachers, to ask questions in the chat. We've got a really incredible panel here and they're talking about lots of exciting things. So if you have a question as they're talking, put it in there and we'll do our best to bring it up and ask them so that you can get your questions answered. And be selfish because this is for our teachers. So ask the questions that you want to know the answers to. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and be, since we have the luxury of having people here who are working with data every day, to ask you a little bit about what you're seeing in the field. Are you noticing that there are any kind of new trends or emerging trends that you're seeing in data use, in data literacy, in the kinds of skills that are needed? And which ones do you think are going to be particularly important for teachers to pay attention to?
So I'll tap into maybe one of the skills that I think is foundational, and then I trust that my colleagues who are what I would call the hardcore data scientists will take this the next mile in a sense. But as I shared in the intro, my team works in the knowledge space, and so we're not the ones like Stacy, for example, that are working on algorithms and interrogating the data. But before you can get to those spaces, I think one of the key concepts that we can maybe spark in our students is the data curiosity that we've been mentioning so far as a theme in this panel. And the concept that I would try to tease out of that is this idea of data sets, so large sets of data, and then how to link them together, which then enables us to ask more and more complex questions. And I remember personally for myself, it was in college when I realized that everything in the world has like a database behind it, literally, and that database is a 2x2 structure of data that's linked to more data and more data. So when I go and go to the bank and make a transaction, I just remember my mind exploding. And I go, okay, how do we break that down, simplify it, and make it relevant to a high schooler? And knowing that we're talking to STEM teachers, an example that I might propose and throw out there is take the periodic table of elements. Encourage your students to be curious about it. And as opposed to going into a lesson where you have a plan that says, hey, we're going to look at how the certain elements in the table transition from solid to liquid to gas. And we're going to look at these three elements that tend to do this at this degree. Actually invite them and say, you know what, we're going to do this lesson, but to figure out which elements make that transition, let's show you using data how we could figure that out. Let's create the periodic table of elements in a 2x2 Excel spreadsheet. Here's the symbol, and here's the molecular weight, the description. And then, hey, by the way, I happen to have this other data set that shows the symbols and the temperatures they change state at. And before we figure that out, let's just focus on metals versus non-metals. First data set, filter. And this is all basic stuff in Excel using a simple tool that everyone probably has access to. And then did you know that you can merge data sets in Excel? A little fancy Excel code there. Nothing too hard that you can't Google. They're probably already figured out on YouTube. And now you can answer the question, what are the non-metals that transition to liquid state at 1500 degrees Celsius? And examples like that, I think, can really bring to light this notion of there is so much data out there that one we can create or we can curate and get access to. But then we can begin, as Stacy was saying, asking questions, probing and poking at the data, and using this as an example to instill that curiosity, show them there might be a gap, that we don't have the data for temperature, but then we can build that bridge, link it, and ask another question. And so I go back to a foundational building brick is data sets, linking them, but then inviting them and showing them how they can do them using tools that most people can get at their own disposal.
Yeah, I'll just riff off of where Brian is going, because this theme of connectivity of data is, I mean, this is one of the macro themes that's going on in not just in data, just in the world in general, in globalization of society. Everything, in terms of how our economies are all linked across the world, species are all interlinked in terms of how symbiosis and predatory relationships, supply chains, as we all know in the COVID era, how fragile they've become because of how tightly coupled and linked supply chains are for us to get goods produced and distributed. Social networks, the connectivity in social networks of the data about people, how you behave across space and time. It's all about connections in data, and it's the same thing, and it stems from connections in data, like Brian is talking about. And it's these relationships between data. We can now take Brian's chemistry example and hop over into biospace and say, let's say I've got my amino acids and I have their molecular formulas and atomic compositions, and now I can link it. I've got my my carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, etc., and I can now link it, whether it's DNA or protein, and now I can link it to Brian's data set of the periodic table, and now I can ask questions across my amino acids or to my molecular composition, my periodic table data set that Brian's got by joining these things. And now that I'm in the amino acid space, now I can hook into proteins, data sets, etc. And it just keeps these basic joins of data sets, while they seem sort of basic at the surface, they're at the nexus of how do you actually build up larger and larger data sets that can actually power really important questions for companies, for organizations, and for all kinds of purposes. It's this theme of connectivity and linkage that's absolutely critical. How does my data relate to someone else's data, or to data out in the public domain that's already been published or that's available to me, etc.?
I can kind of talk a little bit about my experience sort of going down a data-driven path, I suppose. I started out in biotechnology, so I got a lot of exposure as a student to data, I would say, but it was very much more into like biostatistics and kind of what we would describe as kind of like descriptive data science, right? And I just found that aggressively boring. Not to say it's not very important, because it really is, but as like sort of a more of an engineer, kind of a builder type of person, I just wasn't interested in just describing a statistical distribution and how using the mean and the median and running a MANOVA test. Like I didn't care. So I definitely kind of missed that opportunity early in my kind of being a student in high school and undergrad. It wasn't kind of until being exposed as a software engineer to kind of like the predictive power of data science and machine learning that I was like kind of reignited in my interest. And of course I had to go back and redo all the statistics classes, but the impetus wasn't there just with the descriptive things. So being able to answer predictive questions, the value of it kind of clicked at that moment for me. I was watching a lecture from Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, and it was on kind of the future of software engineering. And I was watching this as a software engineer. And he said, in the future, all software engineers will be teachers of machines. And that's when I was like, oh, I will be illiterate in 20 years if I do not myself become a teacher of machines. And that means kind of at least kind of starting with those predictive tasks all the way up into doing something like teaching a car to drive itself, right? And so that's when it really clicked for me as something that I should really pour more attention and learning into. And I have to imagine there's students out there that don't care about t-tests, but might care about something more predictive and fun, quote unquote.
Yeah, as a data scientist, I agree with everything Wes just said. Sometimes the statistics can get a little mathy and it seems so separated from the real world. But if you're able to connect that and say, this is how we can use this tool to answer these questions that you're interested in, that's how I got interested in it as well.
I think there's a silly example where you could say for Wes and Jessica or Stacy, where it's like, for example, Tesla's autopilot system. You know, every kid out there has heard about Tesla and the autopilot system. That's built off of machine learning. Right? If you keep taking those building blocks back, it connects like, oh, like this is something I experienced, and depending on how they feel about it, it's pretty cool. But that's where like the mathy stuff gets in. That's what it can be used for. Versus your point, the end goal isn't the t-test. The end goal, you know, is application in something we experience, right?
Yeah, I like to think of these things as tools, not necessarily ends in of themselves. It's important to understand how to understand the question and use the data science, data literacy, whatever you want to call it, in service to that question, not necessarily just to learn how to program. Programming is really fun, but it's just kind of gets you to another spot. And the field is always growing and changing. I mean, even since I started in data science, it's different than, you know, in the last 5 years, 10 years. So the most important thing to be able to do is to understand and accept that challenge and problem solve and be able to kind of take your skills from one tool and adapt them to another. So it's not necessarily super important to pick the right database or structure or dashboarding tool. It's more important to understand how to build a graph or how to use that graph to answer your question.
I love this through line of kind of, it almost sounds like a superpower that students are getting if they learn to develop this kind of skill of connectivity. When, you know, Dan, when you were speaking, I found it was kind of like the Matrix, where all of a sudden you're like, you see the connection here and a connection here and a connection here, and you can see kids possibly getting excited about that. And I think about sort of so where do they start? Like, what is that entry point? And how do we support teachers to provide those entry points in the classroom? And I saw we did have a question in the chat, and I know we're going to get to this, Marty, with you, with some of the LabXchange materials that we're going to talk about in a minute. But about sort of, well, so what can teachers use? Is there good curriculum out there that helps build these skills? Or just from your own experiences, are there things that are more accessible maybe to lay people? How might they help their students begin to practice those skills of making connections with from one tool to another or from one data set to another?
I'm hoping maybe Marty can step in with this bridge. In terms of curriculums that are available. I'm not aware of particular curriculums. I've certainly seen data sets out there. I just saw one out on census.gov, actually, where you can get access to public data for the US, census.gov/ can't remember what it was. I'll look it up. For data visualizations, it's an interesting way to look at just different kinds of data sets that are practical that people will recognize, students will recognize. And I think it's important to start with data sets that are in a field that they, not a field, I want to call a field, a topic that they enjoy, whether it's food or music or sports or weather, something that's very, you know, accessible to them. I think that's the place to start. If you want to look at trends, look at how memes spread virally in terms of like, that's data that they'll understand. How does stuff that ends up on TikTok end up spreading to millions of people so quickly? Which ones succeed, which ones don't? Look at things like college statistics in college applications, which is again, my son's a senior in college going through that whole process. So looking at all the data that you have at your disposal there and how to interpret it. I think it starts, I guess I would say it starts with data sets that are going to be attractive and approachable for the students, and maybe not necessarily the mainstream science hardcore things that we might want to instill in them. But in a sense, I think they have to start with something that's going to be much more approachable for them to really get a hook, in a sense. That's my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Dan. I think the nudge I would give students and teachers is there might not be a curriculum, but it's realizing that you can Google and find these types of accessible data sets on the internet free of charge. Quality, and going back to, you know, some of the things I shared before, how do you make sure it's high quality, reliable? But then the second part being, you know, grab, you know, Excel and Google, how do I do this? You know, how do I find XYZ pattern using XYZ formula and try it? And I think the school of experience and trying things, and once again, going back to, we can ask questions of data is the foundation. And what data do we have? And then a common tool that students will have access to, some kind of spreadsheeting tool that can allow them to do formulas. And that just like opens that first step, I feel like, before they realize what's possible next and then next, and they start asking more and more complex questions, but the foundation of linking data sets is laid there.
I appreciate all of you, and particularly just how different your experiences of data have been, but we've also heard a lot of kind of commonalities, this kind of common thread of the linkage is important, the questioning of data is important, knowing what questions you want to ask. And along the lines of, Marty, please tell us some of the great stuff that we have that can help build these bridges. So maybe now's the time to turn it over to you, and you can share a little bit about what you've been doing at LabXchange.
Beautiful, thank you so much. And of course, we should also all listen to Dave, who's an amazing colleague as well, and so such a wonderful person to get to work with. Let me, I'll share my screen just a little bit to maybe answer one of the questions that we were just kind of talking about, which is like, how do we engage with data sets? And I would say, like, if I were to kind of skip ahead a little bit, a lot of what we do at LabXchange is creating like virtual lab spaces where you can pick up a pipette and actually like start doing experiments by putting a pipette tip on a pipette and learning how to adjust the volume to a particular volume, and then figuring out how to like open tubes and transfer something from a reaction to another reaction to kind of set up a series of controls and whatnot. So we developed a lot of these like virtual lab spaces because we realized like these are like basically the most privileged spaces in science, that these are spaces that people don't all have access to, that not everyone has the opportunity to do a science lab. They don't have the resources in their high school. They might not have a nearby college to go visit to do something like that. So how can we make like a virtual simulation where people can kind of engage with spaces they might not otherwise have access to do science? But of course, exactly to what you're speaking to, everyone has been speaking to, science is not only done in a lab right now. In fact, a lot of science happens online, involves using data sets. We have the human genome is online, the yeast genome is online, the Drosophila genome is online. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of mutations involved in cancer are online on the Human Cancer Genome Atlas. So there's a ton of information that we're really kind of in the space of, that we're really beginning to try to figure out how can we train people who can access the internet, how they can actually start asking scientific questions. Like how can they like go through a data set that they might find authentically engaging and say, let me try to understand, like maybe no one has looked at this particular gene and how it relates to this particular disease, and maybe I can find something. And frankly, as a college teacher, I had students kind of come up to me all the time with little questions that people haven't answered yet by just noodling around the data. And I think that kind of curiosity and those kinds of data sets are like amazing things to try to train people on. So as a part of the Amgen Scholar Project, which in like so many summer research projects last summer was largely remote. So we had to try to come up with ways to begin to train people on how to do a remote research project. How can you ask and begin to answer questions just using bioinformatic tools? And so one type of data literacy that we were trying to develop was being able to understand a sequence alignment. And this is like just a basic way that biologists begin to understand if something's important, is by looking at the same gene and seeing if the same gene, like a couple different versions of the same gene, if it's consistent across multiple organisms or multiple different kind of species or things like that. And so we begin with trying to show a type of data, like the sequence alignment of 3 different genes, and then try to slowly walk through it and deconstruct it. So in one asset, we try to take apart that a sequence alignment and say like, okay, well, here are the 3 sequences that we're aligning. At like each column along the way is a position, like it's amino acid number 1, 2, then 3, then 4. And then this thing at the bottom is this score. It tells you how well conserved the amino acid is. And here's like this kind of scoring matrix they use. And here's what a little change looks like. And here's what a big change looks like. And here's how you can kind of like begin to annotate things like this. But of course, like a significant way in which anyone learns how to make any kind of data is by being able to make it themselves. And so another thing that we really care about is not being able to just interpret a sequence alignment and be able to make an argument from it, but also how to generate your own sequence alignment. So again, how do you go and use bioinformatic tools to look up some sequences, copy and paste them into any kind of text doc you want, and then plop them into an alignment tool, in this case, Clustal, which is just a free alignment tool that we can use, put in those sequences and get the alignment out just by like pushing those buttons, and then you can kind of begin to interpret them. And this kind of pathway kind of continues on to see like okay, if you think that you are finding important conserved sequences, you can actually begin to look at that in 3D space too, again, with free bioinformatic information that's just online on the internet. And here's like a couple of tools to kind of like walk you through how you can annotate questions involving cancer, like RAS is the gene that's mutated in about half of human cancers. So like this is an incredibly important gene that we're always like trying to study and understand what's going on with it. Let me take a step back. So this is kind of like trying to like talk about like authentic biological databases, but really I would say that like we have an approach to data literacy, and here are like two pathways I'd like to share. And these are pathways we just kind of plop together just to put all of the content into one spot that we can share. But also for the Amgen Scholar Project program last summer, we developed a bunch of content about how to interpret biological data. So for example, gel electrophoresis data for DNA molecules or proteins, or Western blots, a slightly more advanced protein tool, or sequencing data. And the common theme you'll see for each one of these is that we have like this repeating pattern. We have like DNA sequencing, how to interpret DNA sequencing, the basics. Then how do you read through common issues, right? Because, you know, nothing looks ideal, right? So like, how do you interpret real life data and how messy it looks? And then some questions to kind of figure out, you know, like, can you apply that to a real world example? Like, we don't just care about being able to kind of theoretically understand these data. So if we were to look at a simple, some examples of that, here's an example of like how to read a DNA sequencing chromatogram from an ideal example. And here's like all the little anatomical parts of that sequencing data that you should look for. And then we also have like, okay, well, it often doesn't look that good as the ideal data, right? So sometimes this baseline noise is a lot noisier than you expect it to be. So how do you deal with that? And sometimes these peaks are not as sharp as you want them to be. They have much less resolution, they're much broader. How do you deal with that? Sometimes the computer that's supposed to be telling you what letter the base is doesn't do a good job, right? Here we have a peak for a G, here we have a peak for an A, but the computer doesn't really know what to do in this like little divot here. So how do we engage with that? And we can kind of go on and on about like the kinds of messiness that happens in real life data. And then question sets for each of these types of data that allow someone to apply what they learned to a real life example. So we pull from like real articles, and we never want to like overemphasize exactly to what Stacy was speaking to, a particular example. We want people to be able to transfer the skills from analyzing one data set to another data set to another data set. That's really where we put the premium on. I should also say that in addition to making stuff about biological data, we also wanted to make stuff about how to learn about the way that data gets presented. So we started from, again, to avoid the mathiness that can be intimidating for a lot of people. We started off with data visualization. And so we have some assets about like just teaching you like the parts of, for example, a histogram. So like, what is a bin, and what's this y-axis thing, and what are we counting, and what are the things I should be looking for? But we also have like kind of cute interactives that we designed about these, about how to make one of these things, or why would someone want to make one of these things? So here, this is like a little animation that starts off with someone in their garden, and they have like a bunch of different heights of the different sunflowers, and they don't know how to communicate this with someone else, right? They have like all these different heights. They have like no idea how to say how tall their plants are with someone else, right? But the solution to being able to communicate the data that you have is not just a list of data points, but is like a way to visualize it. And so thinking about data visualization, or data as a language that we can develop, and as a way of communicating that has goals and has an audience, and that we can understand the effectiveness of this through those goals and audience, and like how we can define like how we kind of throw different data into different bins. Those are really the things we kind of most care about. And then being able, as well as providing people the skills to identify like what not to look for in data. Like, how does data get misused? How does people how do people lie with data? And so as a reader, as a critical reader, what would you want to avoid if you're reading through a data analysis? And so here is an asset we drew up about how to use pie charts. And one problem about pie charts is that they're very bad for comparisons. And this is just like one of those things you tend to see for a while. So this is kind of a classic example that if you looked at these 3 pie charts for A, B, and C for these data sets, it's hard to tell what's going on, what the difference is. But if you looked at the underlying data between these as a bar graph, you'd see that these data set A is quite different than data set B, which is quite different than data set C, which, you know, shows that like some data sets are very good for comparisons. In fact, like a histogram is like a really nice thing for comparisons. And when you're looking for comparisons, there's a couple things you need to look out for. You need to look out for the fact that you want to make sure that if people are doing histograms for comparisons, you want to make sure that they're using the right axes. So this is kind of an example of like where people can lie with data. That if people use the different axes for two histograms, then something could look very similar, but the data underlying that could be very different. This is one way in which we've been thinking about providing both an introduction to like the anatomy of data visualization, or like what does data look like, what are the parts of data, how to interpret it, but also how to critique it so that someone can identify like misleading data or claims that are unsupported by data and being able to refute something like that. And then ultimately, I should say that like in simulations, like in any of these lab simulations, something that we put a lot of time and energy into is a situation where you get a user will get to both predict. Oh, wait a minute, I have to refresh this one. Sorry, I made my prediction earlier. A user has the opportunity before they do the experiment, this virtual experiment, to make a prediction of what they expect the results to look like. So here we ask them to predict the controls. So this control should look like that, and this control should be about 700, and these two are negative controls, so we expect them to disappear. And then when they do the experiment, they would get their actual data. And at the end, I didn't do the experiment, so you don't actually see any data lighting up in this actual box, but we have a user can compare their predicted data to their actual data to the ideal data for that experiment. And then we ask a series of both open-ended questions and conditional, and like these paired questions where they have to both explain what conclusion they draw from their data. So what is the claim? And a linked rationale. So here we have that the data is this mutated gene, that it's smaller than 700 base pairs. No, sorry, it's only 700 base pairs, it's smaller than 1,000 base pairs. So we're gonna say it's the mutated gene, and it's the mutated gene because it's between 500 and 800 base pairs. And we also ask them questions about their controls and whether or not they know what the controls told them, or whether or not there's contamination in the reaction. And this is actually a conditional scenario that 1 out of every 3 times you're going to get different data sets that respond to that. And every time you get a different data set in this gel, you're going to have slightly different versions of the answers to answer. And so this is how we are really trying to emphasize transference. Both the ability to kind of learn what a gel could tell you in one small setting, but then transfer it to make predictions, and then interpret your results relative to your prediction, relative to the ideal results. And then in a reflection section to talk about, okay, if we were to do that for another experiment, what do you need to change? And like, what would you expect to change as a consequence of that? And so like that really kind of pushes this application thing beyond transfer. And so this basically 4-part scheme, basically I'll just kind of like, and on this slide, I kind of skipped ahead of, but like we basically approach the data literacy as something along the lines of introduce someone to the type of data, like for a box plot or an agarose gel or a sequence alignment. What are the parts of that data? What's the anatomy of that data? What is it trying to tell us? How, like, give us some practice in terms of interpreting it. How can we identify what that data can and cannot tell us? And then give us some examples of critiquing that data. And then also get into the practice of how does that data get made. And we're actually very excited to start thinking about the same thing for histograms and violin plots, and begin to like coming up with lessons on R and Python in which users can like take a data set and make their own plots, so that they can actually like learn what a violin plot's saying by making it, which is actually always the best way to learn something. And to provide applied examples in the virtual lab spaces in which they can make predictions and test their results against those predictions. Sorry, that was pretty fast, but happy to chat about any and all of that at much greater depth.
Thank you so much, Marty. I know that when there's so much great stuff there, it's like, it's hard to get it all in the small amount of time that we gave you. So we did paste the link in the chat. So we encourage all of you, to go and check it out at LabXchange and just see what's there, explore. There's so many wonderful resources there. I wonder, we wanted to just take a moment to see if we have any questions from our participants. So any of the teachers who are here, do you have any questions for our panelists? Just take a pause. And feel free to keep adding them in our last few minutes. If you do have questions, we can follow up with our panelists afterwards if you find you think of some. But I hope it will be okay. Dave, if I can ask you, you mentioned in the chat here that you've actually done some bioinformatics with your students. And I wonder if you could share what were the pain points for you and the successes? What did you kind of run into as a teacher that was hard or easy?
Well, we had just finished up the AP Chem prep for the exam, and Delta virus was just coming out at the variant. And so I was thinking about how I could create something that dealt with acid-base titrations. So I said, well, let's look at the side chain groups that were changed between the different variants. They didn't have a lot of experience with NCBI, but I kind of gave them an introductory to it. We looked up the initial viruses that had been shared, and we did a blast and found some of the key changes, the amino acid changes. And then we went in and looked at those amino acid changes, and were they conservative changes, or were they a significant change in the Ka or the Kb? And so they made predictions that these would be major changes in the spike protein structure. So I just took an opportunity with some content that we had just learned, and we were done with the exam. So we sort of dove into to what was happening with Delta, and kids really loved it.
I love that, Dave. Thank you so much. It's a great example of kind of seizing that teachable moment with real data and capitalizing on that. And I noticed that based on what our panelists have been saying was kind of important, this idea of asking questions of the data. Did you find that that was a skill they came to the table with? How did you kind of nurture that skill in your students?
It required a lot of scaffolding. I mean, I'd had these students in prior classes where they got a little exposure their freshman year with biotechnology and how to use the database. So they needed a refresher, but there was a lot of scaffolding that needed to be done to help them make the transitions and connecting their current knowledge with applications in the future.
And we hear that a lot with questioning, that students don't have a lot of practice because we tend to be the ones asking the questions as educators. And so kind of turning that around so students can practice themselves it sounds absolutely essential to some of this data investigation. And so I want to take our last 5 minutes to ask our panelists, do you have sort of one last thought? If teachers are thinking about why this matters to their students, do you have one last thought or piece of advice that you would give to our ABE teachers?
Well, I guess the last piece of advice is, it's come up a couple of times, but I can't hit it hard enough, is the element of curiosity about data, and to develop a healthy skepticism in a sense of looking at data, to be able to interpret it, look at real examples of data together, and invite students to ask questions about it and explore the data together, and be a critical thinker about data. There's so much data that comes across to us via social media, out on the internet, etc., and you have to be able to differentiate it, not just in the classroom in a sense, but just in your personal lives as well. And it's really important to develop that healthy skepticism to be able to interpret data, so you can make good sense of it. But
I'd also cast vision into the students' kind of futures to say that the role that your interrogation of data can play it out as if you were going to be a scientist one day, being able to know the questions you can ask of data, but also to realize that not every student is going to become that next chemist or biologist. I always tell people, I think my parents had grander plans for myself than I did, that I realized, but I get to work amongst some of the brightest people in the world. I've got a bachelor's in business, and I didn't go any further in school yet, but I get to work with these folks, and we get to come together, bringing different skills that we have to the table to answer the big questions together. And I think hopefully something that you're seeing is, even amongst the four of us, we all play slightly different roles, but each of us appreciates that there's an element of how do we bring data to the table, use it to inform the questions that we ask, and just igniting that curiosity in students, as we said, that data curiosity, but also realize that this doesn't mean that you are going to be a research scientist. That's not who you are. If it is, even better, because you'll be able to ask even better questions in that narrow field that you want to go down, or you'll be able to ask others to help you answer these questions who are doing research on machine learning or some next advanced technology or technique. But this notion of, I think Jessica said it well, this is becoming a common skill set that everyone brings to the table, but it helps us to work better together to ask and answer bigger, tougher questions together.
Yeah, I want to just build on that too. Data is everywhere, whether or not you know it or you like it or you hate it. It's not really up to you anymore. You have to be data literate in order to be an effective member of our society. If you use your cell phone, if you watch Netflix, everything is run by machine learning algorithm now. And it's only going to get more pervasive as society progresses. So, be able to have that healthy skepticism and being able to problem solve and be curious about why things are happening the way that they are. Why is Netflix recommending this next show for me? Why is this, protein coming up for this particular amino acid? It's all interconnected, and it's absolutely critical.
Stacy, you mentioned the example of Netflix and why is it recommending it? Many years ago, I asked my son. I was like, because I was a nerd about algorithms and such, and I was like, so Kyle, how do you think Netflix wrote an algorithm to figure out what it should show you next? What would you put in the algorithm, right? And it's a way of exploring that curiosity of what do you think is important to a viewer in terms of recommending things to them. Like it's an interesting, obvious way, kind of in your personal life to explore that. So.
Dan, you kind of stole mine. No, you're good. I would always play this game with myself where it's called How They Do That. And I think there's two parts to it. It's like one, being able to recognize when like data science and data products are at work. Like, even in this video call, I could point to a couple, right? How is Dan's background getting blurred right now? So I think being able to recognize when that's happening and then being able to ask the question, how they do that? It's like, well, yeah, to Dan's point, how does TikTok get so good at making you spend 8 hours on its platform? Those are the things that I think are, real data science and fascinating questions. And they touch on every part of data science, from all the way from like, what is data? Like, is video data? How is video data? How do we represent video to a machine? Like, I mean, does it use eyes and look at it like we do? No, it doesn't, right? So I think like just starting from that very interesting question of how Dan's background is getting blurred, you can actually learn like a tremendous amount about, and it's not like you have to do all the math yourself, but at least if you have a cursory understanding of sort of what those things, those different steps are towards producing the result of Dan's blurred background, then I think that's a really powerful literacy to have.
Marty, you got any additions in our last few seconds of our roundtable?
I kind of wonder what like Dave or Tara thinks about this. But one thing I would always do would, I think it's easy when you read a textbook and you read some famous experiment happened and you look at this data and it says, hence this famous conclusion was made. And it all feels pat. Of course, we all know that this conclusion was drawn. We know that this was the data that came out of the experiment. We know that this was the question that they had. But it's all, I find that I actually always ask students, like, tell me, what if the sentence was the opposite, how would the data have to look different? And like almost inspiring someone to be curious about the textbook and say, like, the data didn't have to turn out any of this way. And if, when a sentence says, blah, 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 see figure 12.2, and you look at figure 12.2, like, see if you can justify it to yourself how that data is confirming or supporting that claim in the sentence, or like what the data would look like if the sentence was the opposite. Like if the data was the opposite, what would the scientists have concluded then? And I think that allows the textbook to become less of a dead, inert thing and allows you to kind of like critically engage with it a little bit more.
Marty, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our panelists today. I know we're at time. I want to tell everyone that we will have this roundtable recorded and posted on our website, so it will become a resource for our whole ABE community. So we're very grateful for your time today. A very powerful call to action. Whether you like it or not, it's here. And so thinking about your role in that, curiosity, questioning, and a healthy skepticism. So a huge thank you to all of our panelists today and to our teachers for joining us, all of you from our ABE community who took the time to be here today. We appreciate you and thank you for adding your thoughts on this really important and timely topic. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks.